Hello and welcome to Euronews. You're watching Special Report NATO live from Brussels and Ankara, where we're joined by our NATO correspondent, Shona. The NATO summit coming to an end with a joint declaration from the allies in which they reiterate, quote, their ironclad commitment to mutual defense under Article 5. That means if one ally is attacked, it will be an attack on all of them. The NATO allies also call Russia a long-term security threat, and they pledge another $50 billion in joint procurement for NATO defense and security capabilities. That is for the joint declaration, but the news very much, as always, driven by the President of the United States, Donald Trump, saying that as far as he's concerned, the ceasefire with Iran is over. He also launched a scathing attack to the Iranian leadership, calling them scum, liars, cuckoo, and a waste of time. He's also indicated that more strikes could follow. All of this is now pushing oil prices up 5% on the day. These moves in the energy market are significant. Let's take a look.
To me, I think it's over. I don't want to deal with them anymore. They're scum. You know what scum is? They're scum. They're sick people. They're led by sick people. And they're vicious, violent people.
Okay, well, let's go now over to the U.S. Of course, we're joined now by John Bolton. He is the former national security advisor to President Trump in his first term. Mr. Bolton, thank you as always for being with us here on Euronews. You and I spoke about 3 weeks ago at the G7 summit, and you told me that this deal was a bad deal and the president of the U.S. had been tricked. At this point, he seems to be saying just that. Where do we go from here, Mr. Bolton?
Well, I think the clear outcome of this discussion is that the ceasefire is very much in jeopardy, and it's very hard to predict what's going to happen next.
And that means at this point, however, when the president says the ceasefire, as far as he's concerned, is over, it means what? A return to hostilities over the next 24 hours? Is this a warning shot or perhaps a declaration that hostilities are back on? How do you read it?
It's impossible to read what Trump means. He did say at one point that he was giving advance warning that Iran would be hit very hard tonight. I mean, that could mean going after a few selected targets. The fact is, the Iranians are counting on Trump not to launch a general warfare again because he's worried about the upcoming November elections.
Okay, but at this point, it seems to me there are two tracks here. One is the Strait of Hormuz. He's disappointed that there are what seems to be minor strikes on vessels, so he cannot get the oil out. And then there's a question of the nuclear weapon, and he said that still stands. They cannot have a nuclear weapon. So ultimately, how is the president going to ensure that that happens?
Well, personally, I don't think there is any way to ensure they don't get nuclear weapons until you change the regime. That has been the problem for the last 40 years as Iran has pursued nuclear weapons. I think the issue with the Gulf is more serious because while Iran was shipping its oil out, the Gulf Arabs were not. And now the president has put the sanctions back on Iran, which is significant. Oil prices have gone up 5% today in the spot market. So they're reacting very quickly to news that indeed hostilities might begin again.
And the president also said some very colorful language. He said these people are scum, they're liars, they say one thing and do another. Is that surprising to anyone?
No, this is typical Trump. You know, a few months ago, it's hard to keep all this straight, but he said he had achieved regime change in Iran. The previous leaders had been eliminated, and he now had this wonderful group of people that he was dealing with. So he will say anything at any time, and what he may have said in the past that he's contradicting simply doesn't bother him.
But at this point, he also seems to be admitting in a way that he was tricked by them. I mean, he said it to the press very clearly. He said these people are cuckoo. They say one thing in private and then the complete opposite. So he was conned?
Well, in fact, that's correct. I mean, the negotiators he has working on this, Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, don't know anything about Iran, don't know anything about nuclear weapons. Other than that, what could go wrong?
Well, many things at this point. As you say, the oil market is reacting very heavily to it. But just to move into NATO itself, there is a joint declaration. The allies also say they commit to Article 5, a message clear from the U.S. However, the Europeans will have to take care of their security. Overall, was this a good NATO summit or just the bare minimum?
Well, I think the final statement that was agreed to unanimously is a good statement, and I think it does advance a lot of objectives. I think, frankly, the outcome for Ukraine, maybe not everything that Zelensky may have wanted, but still, nonetheless, very positive. If you leave Trump's critical remarks of Spain and a few other things that he said aside, I think this turns out to be positive for NATO. It's interesting, though, that there's no mention in the final statement of the 2027 NATO summit, which had been scheduled for Tirana, the capital of Albania. Frankly, it would not be a bad thing for NATO not to have a summit next year. Why roll the dice again?
What do you mean by that? Because Mark Rutte said it will happen in Albania, but didn't give a date. Why would it be good to not have a NATO summit?
Well, number one, you don't need a NATO summit every year. If you look at the history of the alliance, sometimes they're once every 2 years, once every 3 years. In recent years, it's been every year, but there's no requirement for that. Who knows what Donald Trump's mood will be a year from now at some unspecified date. If you skipped a year or two, it wouldn't be the end of the world.
And, sir, I want to ask you just a final question on this point. As you said, he lashed at the Spanish. You say they're not a team player. And he also said when it comes to Denmark, they're not taking care of Greenland. He also repeated it should be, quote, under the control of the United States. You know the man one-on-one. Is this a fixation or does he really mean business? By the end of his term, Greenland will be controlled by the U.S.
No, he's trolling people, as they say. In the first term, I was in his office once. He was dictating a tweet, and he told the person typing the tweet, capitalize all the letters in that last sentence, which a lot of people drives them. It just is very, very distracting for people. And he turned and said to me, "Do you know why I just said that?" And I said, "No, why?" And he said, "Because it drives them crazy." So why does he talk about taking Greenland? Because it drives them crazy. That's what it's about.
So it's a provocation. Well, Mr. Bolton, thank you so much for joining us on Euronews, as always. And, of course, for the Europeans, Greenland is not just a provocation. It's really a pressure point. Let's go back to Ankara now with Shona. Mary, of course, some connectivity problems at the start of the show. But, Shona, of course, the leaders are now leaving the summit. But tell us now, ultimately, what is the mood as President Trump walked out of this press conference just minutes ago?
Well, I would say, Maria, that the point that John Bolton had made just there in relation to actually having a summit every few years rather than every year is something that leaders would definitely echo. I think they're sort of breathing a sigh of relief that this wasn't as bad as it could have been. The bar was pretty low. We know that Donald Trump came to Ankara castigating his allies, saying he's going to take over Greenland. And they would say this is actually very damaging, albeit to the fact, as you mentioned there at the start, that the declaration does commit an ironclad support of Article 5, the backbone of NATO. But if that didn't happen, then NATO would be over. So the bar is pretty low in that regard. I'd also make the point that they're breathing a sigh of relief because this morning, when we heard that the United States had launched strikes against Iran, they really thought this summit was going to be completely overshadowed by Iran, when it should be about supporting and defending the European continent and in particular Ukraine. And I caught up with the Belgian Defence Minister Tadeo and I asked him about this piece specifically in relation to Iran.
He says we need to do more, but okay, he understands that we're doing this. You cannot build Rome in one day. So this takes some time. And then he had a lot of emphasis on Iran. So that was the Middle East for me is of particular priorities, yeah.
So on Iran, we know that ceasefire that was fragile at the best of times is no more. What do you think the implications are now for Europe? Because one of the main concerns was that the world was distracted by Iran and not paying enough attention to Ukraine.
Yes, but they're always lying. The Islamic regime, that's a religious Nazi regime, they're always lying and cheating. That is what they do. So saying that they have a peace agreement, first thing that I was thinking is that they will never hold up into their in that agreement. So We'll see about how this is going, where this is going. I don't know if everything is broken now, but it keeps on being one of the main issues. Ukrainian support, we can count on Europe for Ukrainian support. But it's true that the United States is more focalizing on Iran and the Middle East.
And what would tell us a little bit about the conversation then you had with Secretary of War Pete Hegseth in relation to that? Because everybody's worrying about their oil prices, quite frankly.
Yes, of course. Everybody's worried about the oil prices. And also for Ukraine, it's not good that Putin gets too much for his barrel of crude oil. So that's also a direct link. But then again, when they attack gas, LNG ships, vessels, you cannot remain silent.
Turkish President Erdogan was looking for a couple of things out of this summit. Access to the F-35 program from the United States. And he really wants to get rid of this idea that there should be a European preference when it comes to defence industry. That means the European Union. What's your own assessment of that? Is he right to look for those things?
He's right. F-35, that's not of mine business because it is an American product.
But are you happy for him to have them? Because the concern is that the Russian system that the Turks have, the problem is that it could be a security issue for NATO.
Yeah. I think that the Americans will not give F-35 to Turkey when there's a problem with their own security and with Russian threats. So.
And just finally then, Minister, tell us a little bit about what Belgium has committed to, particularly at the Industry Defence Forum. Also, could you tell us about what Belgium's plans are as part of the coalition, the Willing, the Strait of Hormuz?
So on a coalition of Willing, we're there with a mine hunter. It's ready to be deployed. We can also send other capabilities. So when we have green light, we will go. And second, on Industry Day, we signed 10 contracts. The biggest is air defense, NASAMS, Skyranger NASAM system, radar system, air defense for the first time in 20 years. It's a more than €3 billion contract.
A Nazi religious regime. Wow. That was the Belgian defense minister speaking to Shona from that NATO summit. Let's introduce now a panel discussion. We are joined by Max Bergman. He is the director of the Europe, Russia and Eurasia program at the CSIA, and Daniel Fjot of the Center for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy. Thank you to both for joining us on Euronews. Max, let me start with you. What did you make of this summit, and what did you make of President Trump? Because yesterday he started the day very critical. Today he just told the press, look, the Europeans seem to like me, but they say that maybe just to get me. Is there a strategy behind the president's words?
It's hard to say that there's a clear strategy. I think the summit went fine and probably about as good as it could possibly, as NATO could have expected or wished for. Trump, this morning in the press conference, brought back Greenland, which I don't think was music to the ears of the Danish prime minister or anyone else in Europe. But after the summit, he seemed sort of more positive about NATO. And I do think that the summit, as a forcing function, led to some important arms sales agreements that probably would have happened anyway. But it's always good to have this sort of deadline, this forcing function where countries, leaders, companies have to sort of finally come to an agreement. And there was a lot of impressive stuff done on that front. So I think overall, a rather positive summit. The meeting with Trump and Zelensky did not explode. In fact, looked rather positive. So, NATO got through this, and I think they'll live to fight another year.
And Max, just to pick up on that point, how much is the work of Mark Rutte? Would you say he deserves some credit? As you know, there's been a lot of debate that perhaps he is too nice. Others say ultimately when you're dealing with Trump, it's the only way about.
Perhaps. I mean, it does seem like Mark Rutte is auditioning for a job for the Republican Party to be a spokesperson for Donald Trump. And at times, I think it does veer into U.S. domestic politics in a way that I think is really quite off-putting to many Americans. And I think it could be problematic for Rutte's future going forward. But, if he's doing whatever it takes to just sort of get through these summits in a very short-term thinking, perhaps that's the way to go. I think it makes him seem somewhat clownish, though, in Washington. I think it's fairly transparent what he's doing. I don't think he's really fooling anyone. But he seems to have a positive relationship with the administration. And look, the summit worked out. out, and so I think there's some credit that probably has to go to him.
And Daniel, over to you. The question ultimately is this NATO summit crystallizes a very clear message. The U.S. wants Europe to take care of its security, and they want the Europeans to pay for it too. This is NATO 3.0. The question to me is this going to be done in a structured way, or ultimately it becomes chaotic? Based on what you've seen at the summit, which one is it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I agree with Max in terms of the fact that the NATO summit didn't lead to any major catastrophes. But actually, the really interesting story from my perspective is how much work the European allies were doing behind the scenes in terms of arms deals, trying to work together on different aspects of security. It was quite a fruitful summit in all of the backroom meetings that we had between European allies. And frankly speaking, that's what we need. We probably need more of it, and we need it on steroids at this precise moment in time. But it's already a very, very good sign that the Europeans themselves, at least on the defense production, defense industrial side of things, really do get the message that they have to be spending more and spending it wisely on capabilities.
And the question of how you spend the money, though, however, Daniel, this is fundamentally the question now for the European leadership. Do you spend this money on U.S. weapons, or do you try to develop your own industry in Europe? Is it compatible with a 5% NATO expenditure that is basically designed, essentially created to appease Donald Trump? Who's going to make these weapons, and who's going to buy them, and from who?
Yeah, I mean, there are two stories here. The type of weapon systems that we don't really have in large supply in Europe at the moment, which probably means that there'll be a very short-term dependency on the US and defense industry. Of course, the question there is whether or not the defense industry in the US itself can manage the additional pressure of all of these calls and contracts coming from Europe. I think also in the summit, we saw a very positive step forward in terms of Patriot missiles and Ukraine. So very obviously, there are technology areas and equipment areas where Europeans will still be dependent in the short term. However, it's very clear in the long term the direction of traffic. We're not going to be spending taxpayers' money in Europe without a return. And the return comes in the form of jobs. It comes in the form of European-made capabilities. And I think that is the longer-term trajectory for Europe here.
And Max, the other big point is Ukraine. That is essential for the security of this continent. There is an active war in Europe as we speak. For the time being, there is no indication that a negotiation can happen to bring it to an end. But I did notice a shift in tone from President Trump. He talked about Ukraine hitting Russia, an escalation, but maybe a way to end it. And he also said with the Ukrainian president, the relationship seems to be changing for the better. What do you make out of it when it comes to the dynamics between Russia and Ukraine? Who's got the upper hand now?
Well, I think what's very clear is that President Zelensky and Ukraine have a lot of cards now. I think a year ago or a year and a half ago, when the Oval Office meeting happened between Zelensky and Trump, Ukraine, it wasn't clear that they had a lot of cards. They were very dependent on U.S. supplied weaponry. They are still dependent on some U.S. weaponry, particularly Patriot interceptors, which was discussed. But look, the Europeans have stepped up. The EU has acted. The EU is now the major military and financial backer for Ukraine. And Ukrainians are taking this war to Russia. And I think Zelensky had a hot mic moment when Trump, said, would ask Zelensky if he would go to Moscow to meet with Putin. And Zelensky said there were too many Ukrainian drones in Moscow, so it wasn't safe. And I think what is very clear is that Trump has reacted to that, has realized that he can't actually bully Ukraine around, that Ukraine has cards. And so we'll see what happens if the U.S. tries to re-inject itself in trying to facilitate a new peace process. Maybe that could be useful. Hasn't panned out. It wasn't, the previous effort didn't amount to anything. So I think we're in a new phase where, and Europeans, I think, need to recognize this, is that the U.S. doesn't have a lot of leverage over Ukraine. We have some, but we're not planning on using it. And in some ways, Ukraine has moved on and is really focused on interacting with Brussels and other European capitals.
Well, thank you to both for joining us with those insights. And that was one of the remarkable moments today with the president of Ukraine saying there are too many drones in Moscow. It may not be difficult or may be dangerous for me to go see Vladimir Putin there. That meeting is certainly not taking place in Moscow. But let's go back to Ankara with Shona. Of course, Shona, you've been there now for 3 days. I know you've spoken to NATO officials, European diplomats, heads of states. The question, and this is still fundamentally the question, to me, walking out of this NATO summit, was this a good NATO summit for the Europeans?
I think the Europeans will feel that they have a lot more dignity and a lot more skin in the game and a lot more respect. And in particular, self-respect is a term that I've heard from a lot of diplomats from NATO member states, because they pledged, as we said yesterday, $50 billion worth of investment when it comes to tanks, interceptors, Patriot missiles, and also $40 billion for drones, which is obviously an immediate capacity that is required. That comes obviously at a time when the United States has removed assets and capabilities with immediate effect from NATO, including long-range bombers and so on. So the Europeans are taking control of their own continent. The other part is that the investment yesterday we heard about is really long-term. So for the moment, the continent still needs the United States, and they still need to purchase American weapons, because the ability in terms of the defence industry in Europe is not quite there yet. So the question about still relying on the United States is still the one that exists for the moment. But I caught up with the Estonian Prime Minister, Kristen Michal, and I asked him, because obviously, of course, Estonia is a country that is close to Russia and experiences a lot of interventions from Russia. And I asked him about his takeaways.
Topic was security, investing in defense, the defense industry. Also the questions about the Middle East, which is very this kind of up to date. And these were the topics, but not Greenland.
Tell us about NATO 3.0. Is this the beginning of NATO 3.0? Because if you even compare 26 to 25, the level of spending by Europe and Canada has increased really historically.
Yeah. I would say that the message is there, because when you look at the numbers, it's 139 billions in dollars, US dollars, that last year, 2025, was increased by Europe and Canada, the expenditure. So I would say that increasing goes on because everybody has made a pledge and promise in Hague to go to 5%. Estonia, for example, our defense expenditure this year is already 5.4. And if we add this kind of wider military investments, 1.5 to that, so I would say it's almost 7%, as in Lithuania, Latvia, Poland. So I would say this, yes, NATO will grow stronger, Europe will grow stronger, we will have more capabilities and also more defense industry, which is very much needed because Russia still out-produces us, even though their economy is size of a medium European country.
Donald Trump and the United States has clearly had a different relationship with Europe. There was a feeling, if Putin were to test Article 5, particularly if he were to do something in Estonia, we wouldn't know the answer to that.
I would say that we know because, for example, we had de-sinking of Baltics from Russian energy grid. At that moment, we needed NATO to step up, and I called Mark Rutte. And we have NATO ships on the Baltic Sea guarding our critical infrastructure. And that is a little bit later. MiGs from Russia came into our airspace. Italian F-35s, which were air policing, went up, escorted them out. So NATO on the practical level is working well. And also, for example, Romanian fighter jets shot down a drone. This was only the second time in NATO's history on Estonian soil. So that means that NATO on the military level is working well. We have chain of command, everything in place, procedures, operational control, everything. And Russia knows that. But probably this kind of rhetoric from Russian side and friends of Russia, this is the cognitive warfare Putin wants to have. He wants to have us believe that he will be in Kiev in 3 days and so on. It's 50 years. He's losing 35,000 of his own. He has a burning gas station in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Ports are burning. He's turning down Telegram, 5G. He's getting more paranoid. So this is the image he wants us to believe.
Do you think Putin's on his way out?
Hopefully, but the pressure should remain.
And that was Estonia's Prime Minister. Estonia being a Baltic country key in the eastern flank. And of course, we've seen over the past few months also impacted by drones affecting its airspace, the same as a number of other Eastern European countries and Baltic countries. But let's stay in Eastern Europe because today, very much in focus, a bilateral meeting between President Zelensky and Donald Trump. Of course, there's been expectations that they would meet face to face. It's not always easy. That meeting did not happen at the G7, but it did happen on the sidelines of NATO. Let's debrief with our Ukraine correspondent, Sasha Vakulina. Sasha, it's not a secret. The relationship between the two men has not always been easy. Today, however, the president of the U.S. seemed to strike a much nicer tone. Is this the start of a new dynamic in their relationship?
Well, Maria, this is something that Kyiv certainly is hoping for. As you said, even the fact that this meeting, the bilateral meeting, took place in Ankara already makes this trip of Volodymyr Zelensky to the NATO summit successful compared to some of the previous, like the G7 at Evian in France. And the two had a very candid conversation. But of course, the most important thing and the most important takeaway for Kyiv and for Volodymyr Zelensky was the statement by Donald Trump that the U.S. will provide Ukraine with a license to produce Patriot interceptor missiles. Now, this remains the only weapon that Ukraine can use that can shoot down Russia's ballistic missiles. Let's take a listen to what Donald Trump had to say.
So one of the things we're going to be talking about is we're going to give a license to you to make Patriots. That's pretty cool, right?
Very.
This way you can't complain that we're not giving them enough. I said, make them yourself. We haven't informed the company of that yet, but that'll work out all right. You know, I'm sure they'll be thrilled.
Ukraine has been lobbying to get those licenses for over half a year because with one of the latest attacks when Russia launched up to 30 ballistic missiles at Ukraine, not a single one of them was intercepted. Kyiv just simply did not have any interceptors left to shoot those ballistic missiles down.
And of course, we've seen that pounding on Ukraine over the past few weeks. Very difficult when it comes to the air defense, but also the Ukrainian president saying this is not war that is fought in the skies. But ultimately, Sasha, the question is, will this now bring, when it comes to the diplomacy, a negotiation that could finally seal something, anything that looks like a peace deal? What about a meeting with Vladimir Putin? Is that closer now?
Not that close yet, but certainly Donald Trump said that he's still working on getting that meeting done. Now, the question is, of course, whether this, in theory, would be bilateral between Volodymyr Zelensky and Vladimir Putin, or Trump would also participate. Now, Trump said that he talked to Putin, and he does quite a lot, and he said that Putin would want to meet, and he doesn't mind meeting Zelensky, and insisted that he would want to do that in Moscow. And as we've heard at the panel earlier during the show, Volodymyr Zelensky responded that Moscow is quite dangerous recently with lots of Ukrainian drones that are reaching not only Russia's capital, but also over 2,000 kilometers deep into Russian rear now.
Of course, Sasha, well, thank you for that. And also a clear message from the Ukrainian president saying he would not want to go to Moscow. The president of the U.S. also seemed to concede today that this meeting cannot happen in Moscow either. He also said he wants to put an end, but never put a deadline on it. This is a war that he said he could fix in 24 hours. Now it's been running for many, many months and many lives. Thank you, Sasha Vakulina. Now I just want to bring you some words, some lines coming from that press conference of President Trump saying once again that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon, that this is about removing the ability of Iran to getting this nuclear weapon, and also saying that the U.S. can be prepared and is prepared to hit them hard. Also giving what seems to be a warning about more strikes that could come as soon as tonight. Let's go back to Ankara for a final word with Shona. Mary, of course, Shona, we heard from a number of European leaders. We heard from the NATO Secretary General under criticism perhaps for being too nice, but saying that this is what the the NATO should do, stay united, and the president of the U.S. But overall, what are the final takeaways from this, and what do you make of the summit ultimately? It's wrapping up. Was this an effective summit?
Well, it was. I think Sasha made the point earlier, which was very important, about the licensing when it comes to Patriot systems being given now to Ukraine. That is key for Ukraine, but it's also really important for the whole of Europe, which has been straining every sinew to pay for weapons to go to Ukraine since the Trump administration withdrew its support there. So that is very important. And the point, I guess, as well, is that actions speak louder than words, because, of course, Trump is shouting at NATO allies about Iran, about Greenland, but what he does is much more important. And when we saw him remove those capabilities from the NATO force model, F-16s, F-35s, even in times of war, that was quite dramatic. We've also seen him over the past few weeks and months tinkering when it comes to forces, US forces in Europe, 5,000 troops being removed from Germany, 4,000 from Poland. So those things are very inconsistent and they very much damage the alliance. But overall, I think that slight change in tone from Donald Trump and Zelensky is very much welcome. But at the same time, I did speak to many people after that. They said, look, beware, because that can change at any moment. Now it's the time for Europe to just step up. And when it comes to Iran, I think that's a really difficult issue for Europeans as well, that this war is going to restart apace because they don't want to get involved. They're willing to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. But if the Iran war goes bad, they know they'll get it in the neck from Donald Trump, because a lot of people have been saying when Iran goes bad, the Europeans get it because he likes to distract them. But I caught up with Xavier Bettel, who's the Luxembourgish foreign minister and deputy prime minister, and I asked him about Europe's relationship with Trump.
The fact is, the relation is more fragile, to be honest, and it's unpredictable. My goal is not to say that we don't want to have any relations with the US. It is to be able to work in this more complicated situation than the one we knew from before, but not to give up. And to see how we can find a common way. And it's, you know, if for the Americans to have a relation with someone, it's to have a win-lose situation. It's not how we are going to build up a situation.
But do you think that the European countries have maintained their own dignity in this regard? Because you see that there is a sort of a level of, supineness when it comes to how they treat Donald Trump. We see it with Mark Rutte, although he has a different sort of role. He's to keep NATO together. But there's not a lot of defending themselves.
You know, I learned when I was in the kindergarten, and if someone was bullying me, sometimes not to answer was the best answer.
On Iran, this issue has obviously come back to the table, crashing overnight because the United States launched strikes against the Iranian regime. So what do you think Europe should do about it? Because we know Donald Trump is very angry and really targeting member states for not helping Iran in the first place.
But you have two things. You have one thing, a war against Iran, and you have one, the protection of Hormuz. Protection about Hormuz, I'm ready to support as much as we can, because we see that even if they said that they want to destroy this nuclear weapon from Iran, they found a new weapon. Hormuz is more efficient than any nuclear weapon. They don't target even one country, they hurt all of us. So the Iranian regime found out that in fact Hormuz is the biggest big bird that they have to harm all of us. And so if we have it's in common interest, because we will have not only the economic impact, but also humanitarian, all the fertilizer, all the food. It will be a huge problem for a lot of countries. So I want to do this, but I'm not part of a war against Iran.
You said to Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, that you didn't believe that the Iran war passed the test of international law, that there was no imminent threat to the United States, nor was there a Security Council resolution.
I'm hearing since 25 years that the nuclear weapon is ready in Iran in 3 months. I hear that from Israeli side since ever. Since ever. I hear it now because we need to attack and launch a strike on them because they are ready with nuclear weapon. I hear that since 30 years now. That's the first thing. The second thing is, when we speak afterwards always about the respect of international maritime law, I just want to remind that to have a strike, the usual way it's to ask a mandate or to have these international organizations where you inform the colleagues and you see to have islands, and not Israel and America deciding to do this and then you cannot just use international law when it sounds good into your own ears.
And this brings to an end the NATO summit with a joint declaration commitment to Article 5, but a major curveball with Iran. Perhaps more strikes, a return to hostilities, and a big reaction in the energy market. All of this, you best believe, will have big ramifications in Europe. That is it for Special Report. I'm Maria Tadeo, and this is Euronews.